The parish looked safe. A white chapel stood over a swept road, and a small bell touched the morning without strain. Behind hymn books and wedding ribbons, Fear found a chair and sat still. 13 women went into labor here across 3 years, and each time the church pulled its curtains and tried to move on. Meals were left on stoops, coins passed to widowers, shawls draped over chairs where no child would reach. No tiny graves took root beside the old stones. People said things that made silence sound holy. They did not ask why the door never opened for the child. They did not ask how a town could lose 13 mothers and never find one newborn to bless. Sunday after Sunday, pews filled. The pastor spoke about endurance and duty. He did not look at the ledger, but the clerk did. Nathaniel Hale was young and careful. He liked neat lines, proper dates, the small notes his teacher taught him to write in the margin. He turned the book and ran a finger along the birth column and the death column. The mother's names sat there in black ink. The infant names did not. In their place lay pale space like a bruise on paper. Nathaniel told himself that a missing name can be a simple thing. But the missing repeated, returned, settled, until the page began to feel like a room with a door that never opened. He had seen hunger take a child, fever take a child, ice take a child. He had never seen silence take them all before breath. People looked to the midwife because they always had. Agnes Whitford had a calm face and a steady way of standing in the door. She knew which herbs softened pain and which prayers steadied a room. When she walked the lane with her basket, men tipped their hats and women opened their doors. They called her good and tried to believe the word. Agnes thanked them and kept moving. She walked the same narrow path to the same houses, her shawl pinned in the same corner, as if time itself used her steps as a measure. She was a promise of order when days shook. Order can be a soft blanket or a tight band. The talk flared in kitchens and cooled in the back pews. One woman said this was a curse left by a mother once wronged. One man said the town had grown proud and God was taking the firstborn to bring them low. Another pointed to the wind that burned lungs and to the winter that sat like a stone on roofs. A few, when their cups were almost empty and the room was almost dark, whispered about a watcher in the birthing rooms, not a face, not a form, only a sense that the air waited to be told when to move. They did not call it a person. It is easier to fear the wind than a hand. In every house where labor began, the same simple things were set out on the same plain stools. A basin of boiled water, linen folded into clean squares, a string cut to length for tying a bleed, a candle stub pressed to a saucer to catch the wax. Steps were followed and breaths were counted, and the rooms ended the same way. Sheets were washed and lifted to the high lines behind the houses where the wind could act like nothing bad had happened. Children watched cloth billows and did not know the weight it carried. Nathaniel kept to the ledger, but the ledger did not keep to him. He began to note that many of the deaths came in thin moon weeks. He saw the candle recorded by the same witness as burned to the same stub. He found himself listening for the bell even when no rope moved, because his body had learned the weight of that sound. He did not tell anyone what he saw. He was not a man who loved trouble. He told himself stories that pushed back the dark. He said the mothers were delicate. He said winter is a thief. He said a string of sorrow can happen without a hand to pull it. Agnes moved through these days without struggle. She checked on widowers and left small jars of salve for cracked hands. She showed young wives how to breathe and keep their thoughts steady when the pains took hold. She spoke in a voice that did not rise, and it made people feel safe. Children waved to her because she tied ribbons to their wrists and told them to run. She was what a town wants from a healer, patience, quiet, no demand except trust. By the 13th mother, the town no longer wept in the same way. The funeral meals tasted flat. The bell sounded the same note each time and sank into the bone. A few began to leave small tokens by the church gate to calm what had no name. No one said what they feared. They did not have to. Agnes kept walking her path and nodded to each door. Nathaniel kept turning pages and tried not to see how paper can hold a pattern the eye refuses. Out past the last fence, snow kept its own record. Tracks linked house to house and ended at a plain door. They were not the steps of a curse. They were human and patient. The thaw would wash them soon, and then there would be nothing to see. For now, the parish held its breath and called it faith. For now, the ledger waited for a hand to turn the next page, and a steady hand prepared another room where the candle would burn, the water would steam, and silence would choose its hour. Agnes Whitford carried herself like a shadow that had learned to wear flesh. Her face was calm, her eyes quiet, her hands steady. She moved through the parish like a familiar hymn, soft and dependable, and for that very reason no one thought to question her. She was a widow, a woman who had buried her own losses in silence, and people mistook that silence for strength. When a mother's pains began, the first name called was hers. The men fetched her by lantern light, the women waited for her basket of herbs, and the children ran to watch her shawl sway as she walked the frozen paths. She never hurried, yet she always arrived before the worst began, as if she could hear the cries before they left a mouth. Inside the birthing rooms, Agnes became more than a helper. She became the final word on what life would stay and what life would leave. Mothers trusted her touch, husbands trusted her judgment, and pastors blessed her patience. She spoke little during her work, only simple instructions. But her eyes were fixed on things the family could not see. She did not pray aloud, but her lips moved, forming shapes no one recognized. When the time came, her hands were precise, neither cruel nor kind, but deliberate, as though she were following an order written long before the pain began. Again and again, mothers slipped into a strange end, not screaming, not broken, not torn by fever or loss of blood. Their faces took on an unnatural calm, their mouths soft, their eyes half-lidded, like women settling into sleep rather than being pulled into death. Husbands knelt and begged, families cried out, but Agnes never faltered. She pressed the women's hands to their sides, closed their mouths gently, and whispered that their suffering was done. She told them she had given them peace, but peace was not what the room felt. The room felt robbed, stolen of the sound that was meant to follow the sharp cry of new life. No infants ever came, not one in 13. Agnes claimed they had not survived the ordeal, that God had taken them before the first breath. She wrapped the tiny bodies before anyone could see them, swaddled them in linens she always carried herself, and carried them from the room under the cover of duty. The families, shattered with grief, did not ask to see. They believed her words because belief was easier than doubt. To doubt meant imagining something far worse than a natural tragedy, and none dared to look at her steady hands and think of them as instruments of ruin. She cultivated her role with precision. She visited grieving families days later, her voice low, her eyes heavy with sorrow, as though she bore their burden herself. She left small jars of balm, whispered of healing herbs, and prayed over doorways in tones that sounded like care. Women clung to her, not only as a midwife but as a keeper of grief, someone who had walked so close to death she must understand it better than they ever could. Agnes wore that trust like a cloak, one she had stitched herself from years of patience and quiet observation. But underneath that cloak was something far colder. Agnes did not see childbirth as creation. To her it was an exchange, a weighing of bodies and spirits, a moment where she alone could decide what would continue and what must be returned to silence. She believed that new life was not a gift to be given freely, but a burden that corrupted the soul of women. In her mind, to stop the child's first breath was to spare the mother from carrying a flawed inheritance. And yet, again and again, she decided that sparing them both was cleaner still. In the stillness of those rooms, she chose silence over life, and her calm was not mercy but ritual. Her methods left little trace. A thumb pressed at the throat until a gasp turned into a final sigh. A measure of crushed root placed on the tongue to numb breath before the lungs could scream. A hand held firm over the belly, not to comfort but to control the last push. Nothing loud, nothing that could be called violence. Only a slow surrender, as though the body had agreed to end itself. This illusion of consent made the deaths harder to question. It made the faces of the mothers look as though they had chosen the stillness, as though they had been guided gently into it. Agnes alone knew how much pressure, how many seconds, how much silence it took to turn suffering into what looked like peace. The parish began to weave stories around her. Some said she carried the touch of an angel, guiding women out of pain and into rest. Others whispered she was cursed, that death followed her basket, though they never said it aloud. When husbands buried wives, they still clasped her hand, still thanked her for trying, because to accuse her meant accusing themselves for allowing her in. In this way, Agnes's power grew. She did not raise her voice or demand loyalty. She received it, given freely by those too broken to see her for what she was. And so the trail continued. 13 women, 13 rooms, 13 moments where life was expected but silence reigned. Each time the same pattern repeated, each time the same calm face looked on. What no one yet knew was that Agnes's hands had become more than tools of craft. They were instruments of a creed she carried inside her, a faith that spoke of silence as salvation. To Agnes, every breath she stole was not murder but devotion. Every death was a prayer answered, though only she knew the words. The town could not yet see the depth of her hold. They saw a widow, a healer, a quiet servant of their homes. They did not see the pattern in the ledger, the repetition in the faces, the strange peace that did not belong to nature. They did not see the shadow gathering behind her eyes, waiting for its name to be spoken. For now they believed in her hands. For now they believed those hands were made to heal, not to deliver them into silence. And for now, Agnes walked among them steady and calm, preparing for the next call of labor, the next room where her soft voice would carry, and the next life that would not draw breath. Nathaniel Hale was a young man of order, trained to see neat lines where others only saw chaos. He had been given the duty of recording every birth and death in the parish, a job many thought dull, but to him it carried a strange reverence. He believed that names written in ink gave weight to existence, that a line of script could preserve what flesh could not. But as the months folded into years, the registry began to trouble him in ways he could not easily set aside. Each time he opened the leather-bound book, he found the same wound staring back at him. The mother's name stood proud, recorded with date and time, witnesses and husbands, all placed with the care of official record. Yet the column beside them, the one meant for infants, lay empty. Not crossed out, not noted as stillborn, simply blank, as if the ink itself refused to carry those small lives. At first he told himself it was grief that left them unmarked, that families could not bear to have the short spark of a life written down only to be forgotten. But the blank space multiplied, and soon the ledger looked less like a record of life and more like a graveyard of silence pressed onto paper. Nathaniel tried to dismiss the unease. He told himself patterns exist everywhere if one looks too long. But the unease did not pass. It thickened, like fog in a low field, impossible to ignore once it settled in the chest. He began to count the entries, tracing his finger over each empty column. 13 times the space remained blank. 13 mothers were buried, 13 infants never given a name. The thought rooted itself in him like a nail driven too deep. He had seen death before, had recorded stillbirths with the sad notation of a short dash in the margins. But this was different. These blanks did not feel like tragedy. They felt like an omission. He watched Agnes Whitford with sharper eyes, though never openly. She always delivered the registry entries to him with calm words, as if reciting a prayer, and he always wrote them down as duty demanded. Yet sometimes, when her hand rested on the book a moment too long, he noticed the faint smell of herbs, the faint press of her fingers as though she were blessing the page or binding it. She would leave and he would stare at the line she had asked him to write, seeing not ink, but shadow. One evening, after the 13th blank, Nathaniel found his curiosity straining against the caution drilled into him. He followed Agnes at a distance, keeping to the darker paths, his breath caught low so as not to be heard. She walked with purpose, never once turning back, until she disappeared into her cottage at the edge of the parish. Through the thin crack of her window shutters, he glimpsed a desk. Not the simple work table she used for herbs, but something heavier, carved and hidden beneath layers of cloth. On it lay a second ledger, smaller, bound in black. She opened it with care, and her hand moved across its pages with a steady rhythm, writing lines that were not names but symbols. The marks were strange, neither letters nor numbers. They resembled circles broken by sharp lines, crosses bent at unnatural angles, small shapes that looked more like wounds than words. Nathaniel could not read them, but he felt the weight of what they meant. Each time she dipped her pen, her lips moved in silence, and her eyes glowed with a devotion that frightened him more than any scream. She was not recording for the parish, he realized. She was recording for something else, something unseen, as though she served a higher ledger than the one kept by men. The discovery pulled at him day and night. He began to dream of blank pages, of lines written only halfway, of names cut short before they could end. In those dreams he heard infants trying to cry, but the sound broke into silence before it left their mouths. He woke sweating, clutching the parish book as though it could answer what haunted him. During the day he tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, but each time Agnes entered the office, her calm presence made him feel as though she already knew what he had seen. He began copying fragments of her entries in secret, scribbling them onto scraps of parchment. He told himself he would learn their meaning, that he could break whatever code she had written. But the more he copied, the more the symbols seemed to bleed into one another, forming shapes that unsettled him, shapes that seemed to move when he turned his eyes. It was as if the marks themselves rejected translation, as if they were alive only to those who believed in them. Nathaniel did not want to believe, yet he could not let go. His unease became something darker, something closer to fear. For the first time he wondered if the parish itself was complicit, if the blank spaces in his ledger were not just oversight but protection. Perhaps no one wanted the names written because no one wanted the truth marked. Perhaps Agnes was not working in secret at all, but in plain sight, shielded by the silence of a town unwilling to face what her hands had done. Nathaniel knew his curiosity had become dangerous. Every glance at her ledger, every attempt to copy a mark, every thought he allowed himself to hold was a step closer to a line he might never return from. Yet he could not stop. He was drawn to the blank spaces the way one is drawn to a wound that must be touched even when it burns. He began to understand that the greatest horror was not the deaths themselves but the erasure. It was not only life that was taken. It was memory, language, the very right of those children to exist even as words. Agnes had stolen more than breath. She had stolen names. And so Nathaniel sat at his desk late into the night, staring at both ledgers in his mind. The official book of the parish and the secret one of the midwife, one written in ink, the other in symbols. One meant for men, the other meant for something else. Between them stretched the silence of 13 missing names, and he felt the pull of that silence growing heavier each day, pressing against him, daring him to break it. Agnes Whitford's cottage appeared ordinary to anyone passing by. Herbs hung drying by the window, the faint scent of lavender and sage drifting into the street. A healer's home that seemed to belong to a woman of care. A shelf lined with holy charms and trinkets reassured visitors that she was guided by both God and nature. But those shelves were only a mask, a wall that concealed something far darker. Behind them, hidden from every trusting eye, was a locked door. The key never left her possession, and no one in the parish had been inside. It was here, in this secret chamber, that Agnes revealed who she truly was. The chamber was small, narrow, and windowless. Its air was heavy, as if the sound itself refused to linger there. The walls were bare stone, cold even in summer, and the floor bore faint stains that could not be washed away. On a table rested tools that did not look like weapons, yet carried the same weight of destruction. Cloths folded with precision, cords cut to exact lengths, small bowls filled with powders ground to dust, and a set of candles burned down not by accident, but by careful measurement. This was not a room of care. It was a room of control, and Agnes ruled it like a silent priestess at an altar of death. Her cruelty was never loud. She did not strike or spill blood like common killers. She worked with a calm hand and a steady rhythm, believing noise was weakness. To her, the greatest purity lay in silence, and she pursued it with devotion. When a birth ended in her care, she did not allow the infant's cry to pierce the air. She pressed the fragile throat between her fingers, counting heartbeats until the body softened into stillness. Sometimes she used a tincture that numbed the lungs before they could open, leaving the child limp without a struggle. To Agnes, this was not murder, but cleansing. She believed she was keeping the mothers pure, sparing them from what she called the corruption of flawed blood. But it did not always end with the child. In her chamber, there were nights when she decided that the mother too should be claimed. If the woman's body resisted, if the struggle lasted too long, if Agnes read fear instead of surrender in her eyes, she considered the silence incomplete. In those moments, she leaned closer, whispering words no one else could hear, and pressed until the woman's final breath was forced into stillness. She did it with ritual care, timing the last exhale so it matched the silence of the child, binding them together as if neither should exist without the other. Agnes believed that only then was the room fully purified, cleansed of sound, left in a state of holy quiet. On a shelf inside the chamber she kept tokens, each one wrapped in cloth and sealed in wax. To an unknowing eye they looked like harmless bundles, but each contained a piece of cloth stained with blood and milk, taken from the first moments of birth and death. She kept them as offerings, labeled with marks no one could read. In her mind, these tokens were prayers preserved, proof of her devotion to a God no one else prayed to. The parish saw her as a woman of faith, yet in this room she bowed not to the church but to silence itself, treating it as the only true divinity. She told herself that suffering was noise, that fear was noise, that pain was noise, and that her duty was to still them all. She convinced herself that she was merciful, even holy, because the women she guided into death did not thrash or scream. Their faces softened, their bodies went limp, and she looked upon that calm as proof that they were ready to be released. She never admitted that it was her hand, her pressure, her powders that created the illusion of peace. She never admitted that silence was not found, but forced. Every time she turned the key in that lock, she entered her true self. The healer, the widow, the calm midwife were only masks. In the chamber, she was the keeper of silence, the one who chose which voices would never be heard. She felt no shame, only purpose. To her, the town's trust was not a blessing, but a shield, a cloak that allowed her to work unchallenged. They called her merciful. They called her skilled. They never knew that in her most private space she was counting breaths, measuring death, and building her own church out of the silence of 13 mothers and children. And yet the chamber demanded more. With every ritual, Agnes felt the hunger of silence deepen, as though each act only widened the hollow. She began to sense that the blank spaces in the parish ledger were not empty but waiting, asking to be filled with more names, more stillness. She believed she was chosen for this work, ordained not by chance but by fate. The world outside her cottage carried on in noise, bells, prayers, laughter. But in her locked chamber she had created a place where noise could not live. And in that quiet, Agnes heard what she believed were answers. Whispered promises that she was doing what no one else dared. No visitor ever suspected the truth hidden behind the shelves of herbs and charms. To them she was a woman of service, a midwife who bore the burden of sorrow. But the chamber of silence remained waiting, its door locked against the world, its walls heavy with the weight of lives stopped before they began. It was here Agnes felt most at peace, most herself, most devoted to the creed she had carved out of death. And soon, another knock would come at her door, another call to bring new life into the world. She would go, calm and steady, trusted by all. But she already knew how it would end. She already knew the silence that was waiting to be claimed. Agnes Whitford never saw herself as a killer. To her mind, killers were reckless, crude, and wasteful, spilling blood and chaos without meaning. What she practiced in her hidden chamber was something else, an art of control sharpened by years of ritual and refined like a science. She believed herself a custodian of silence, not a thief of life. Every motion she made was measured, every breath she took counted, every outcome already prepared before a mother cried out in pain. She was not driven by rage or impulse, but by a devotion born in shadows long ago, when her youth had been tied to a sect that taught her the body was never entirely her own, that breath itself could be offered to purify the soul. That creed had been planted deep, and over the years it took root into something more dangerous, something methodical. Her techniques left no marks that others could trace. She had studied the fragile architecture of the body with patience, as though it were scripture. She knew how a hand placed at the throat could stop breathing without bruising. She knew where to press against the ribs to still the lungs in silence. She knew the exact measure of powdered root that would numb the throat and tongue, leaving the body unable to scream. To anyone watching, the deaths looked calm, as though the mothers had chosen to release themselves. This illusion was Agnes's greatest triumph. She never wanted the world to see violence. She wanted them to see surrender, a soft descent into peace, because then they would never question her hand guiding it. Her chamber was lit always by candle, never by daylight. The flickering flame was her clock, each drop of wax a measure of how long a body could fight before silence claimed it. She did not rush. She waited, she counted, she measured. She believed that timing mattered more than force. Too fast, and the silence was broken by fear. Too slow, and the body resisted with noise. But perfect timing created a quiet so complete that it felt to her like holiness. She called it the cleansing, as if each extinguished cry was not the end of life but the erasure of sin. In her mind, childbirth was not meant to fill the world with noise but to serve as an offering. She saw the cries of infants as corruption, flawed beginnings that stained their mothers with guilt and sorrow. She believed the mothers could only be truly freed if the child never entered the world, and if the mother herself was taken gently into stillness before grief could set its teeth into her heart. She thought she was saving them, delivering them not into the arms of their families but into the hands of silence, which she revered as the only true mercy. The sect she once followed in her youth had been small, hidden, spoken of only in whispers. They had taught her that the first breath of a child was the most dangerous moment in life, when weakness and impurity first entered the soul. To stop that breath was to keep the soul untouched, preserved in its purest state. The sect had dissolved, scattered under the weight of law and shame, but Agnes had carried its words like seeds in her mind. She watered them with every birth she attended, every blank space in the ledger, every body laid out with a face so calm it frightened those who looked too long. Agnes's power lay in how ordinary she seemed. The town saw a widow with gentle eyes, a healer with steady hands. They did not see how those hands mapped the body like a craftsman maps his tools. They did not see the way her gaze lingered on the throat of a mother longer than it should, or how her fingers pressed against the belly not only to guide birth but to control it. She cloaked her precision in care, making her manipulations appear as simple gestures of comfort. But each movement was calculated, each step rehearsed in silence until it became second nature. She believed noise was weakness, chaos, and corruption. Silence was order, power, salvation. That belief shaped her every act, and in it she found a strange peace. When others wept, she remained calm. When others begged, she whispered steady words that disguised her control. She looked into the eyes of mothers as their final breaths slowed, and she told herself they understood, that they welcomed the release. It was not compassion, but delusion, a lie she had told so many times it became her truth. In the parish records, Nathaniel Hale continued to see blank spaces. In the homes, families continued to bury wives without infants. But Agnes only saw progress, a cleansing that grew with each ritual she performed. To her, each silence was not an absence, but an achievement. Another soul delivered untouched. She believed she was building something larger than herself, a legacy of purity that the world would one day understand. For now she worked in the shadows, her science hidden beneath the mask of innocence, her rituals cloaked in the trust of those too broken to question. And so by candlelight Agnes refined her methods, adjusting, measuring, improving. She counted not lives but silences, not cries but the lack of them. She had convinced herself she was chosen, ordained not to bring life into the world but to keep it from tainting the world at all. And with every blank name in the ledger, her faith in her work grew stronger, her control more certain, her chamber more sacred. What she called cleansing, others would one day call unspeakable. But for now, Agnes breathed steadily in her chamber, waiting for the next knock at her door, the next chance to turn birth into silence. Samuel Dorrance had buried his wife beneath the frozen soil with hands that shook from more than grief. The townsfolk had gathered, their faces bowed, their words soft and familiar, but none of it eased the weight pressing against his chest. His wife, Mary, had been strong. She had carried herself with the kind of health that promised a long life, her laughter filling their small home like sunlight on cold mornings. She had been ready for her first child, her body steady, her heart hopeful. There had been no reason for fear, no whisper of weakness in her. And yet she had left this world with the same quiet face that every grieving family in the parish had come to know, calm, untouched by struggle, almost serene in its unnatural stillness. Samuel could not accept it. He remembered the day too clearly. The cries had begun in the early hours, Mary gripping his hand with strength, her eyes locked on his with determination. She had spoken of the life they were about to meet, her voice trembling with excitement. But then Agnes Whitford had entered, her shawl wrapped tightly, her basket of herbs resting by her side, her calm gaze sweeping the room as though she owned it. Samuel had felt a strange unease, but he said nothing. Everyone trusted Agnes. Everyone told him she was the only reason so many births were bearable at all. Yet when the labor deepened, Agnes had asked to be alone. She had closed the door and barred family from entering, her soft words insisting the rite required silence, her hands steady as she guided them all outside. Samuel had stood in the hall, his heart pounding, listening through the door for the sound he had dreamed of for months, the cry of his child. Instead, he heard only muted movements, the scrape of a chair, the faint crackle of candle wax. And then came silence, heavy and suffocating, followed by the slow opening of the door. Agnes stepped out, her face calm, her voice low as she said Mary had passed. The child had not lived. She placed a hand on his shoulder with rehearsed sorrow, assuring him that she had done all she could. Samuel had nodded in shock, his body numb, but the memory burned into him. He had not seen his child. He had not been allowed to hold his wife's hand in her final moments. And now both were gone, swept into silence by a woman whose calm never faltered. As the days passed, grief twisted into suspicion. He could not forget the way Agnes had closed the door, the way she had spoken of a rite, as though birth were a ritual only she understood. He began to question what had truly happened in that room. He asked neighbors if they had been barred as well, and their eyes turned away, their mouths tight. Yes, they admitted, Agnes often insisted on solitude, claiming it was better for the mother's strength. They had trusted her, just as he had. But now Samuel began to see a pattern, one he could not ignore. Strong women, hopeful families, blank columns in the parish ledger. 13 names buried without infants. He spoke of his doubts to others, letting his grief bleed into words. But they met him with silence or dismissal. They told him Agnes had done her best, that childbirth was cruel and unpredictable, that loss was part of life. They spoke as though he were blind with grief, as though his suspicion was a sin against the woman who had given herself to their community. Agnes was their midwife, their healer, their quiet savior. To accuse her was to accuse the town of blindness, and no one wanted to see themselves as blind. Samuel found himself standing alone, his voice swallowed by the trust she had built over years of careful performance. But the doubt remained, gnawing at him. He could not forget the calmness of Mary's face, the absence of fear, the absence of sound. It was as though her life had been pressed out with such precision that even death had been robbed of its chaos. Samuel began to dream of her final moments, dreams where her eyes searched for him while Agnes's shadow loomed above her, steady and silent. He woke in cold sweats, his hands reaching for a child who had never breathed. Each night the silence pressed harder, each day the trust of the town felt more like betrayal. He began to follow Agnes with his eyes, noting how she moved through the parish streets, how she carried herself with unshaken calm. She visited widowers with small jars of balm, prayed over doorways, touched children's hands as though she blessed them. To everyone else she was mercy itself, but to Samuel she had become the architect of his ruin. He saw how people leaned on her presence, how they thanked her for comfort even as the ground filled with more bodies. His suspicion grew darker, sharper, until it was no longer grief alone, but a cold determination to know the truth. And yet, every time he spoke, his words fell flat. No one wanted to listen. No one wanted to see the pattern. He was dismissed as broken, a man who had lost too much to think clearly. Agnes's reputation was a wall he could not climb. built from years of carefully tended trust. He was alone, trapped in the space between grief and revelation, with no proof but his memory of a closed door and a silence that had stolen both wife and child. Samuel carried that doubt like a wound that never closed. Each time the church bell rang for another funeral, he felt it deepen. Each time he saw Agnes's calm face at the edge of a crowd, he wondered how much longer the town would choose blindness over truth. He knew he could not be the only one who felt it. He knew the silence around her was not natural, but he also knew that to name it aloud was dangerous, that suspicion without proof was a noose hung around his own neck. So he kept his questions close, letting them fester in the dark, waiting for the day when silence itself would be broken, when the truth Agnes had hidden so carefully would no longer belong only to her. Nathaniel Hale had lived too long with the weight of blank spaces. The ledger haunted him more than his dreams, more than the prayers he whispered at night to ward off his unease. Every time he turned the pages, the empty columns glared back. 13 infants lost without name or record. His hand trembled each time he dipped the quill as though he were complicit in the silence Agnes Whitford demanded. He had watched her calm face, her soft words, her careful hands, and he had felt the wrongness thickening around her like a fog the town refused to see. It was not enough to suspect. He needed to know. And so, one evening when the parish slept beneath a blanket of snow and silence, Nathaniel carried his fear to Agnes's door. The cottage sat still against the dark. The herbs in the window hung brittle and lifeless now, as if even they had given up the pretense of healing. Nathaniel waited, his breath sharp in the cold, listening for signs of movement. None came. The lock was stiff, but desperation lent him strength. He pushed his way into the small house, the boards groaning beneath his cautious steps. At first it looked exactly as the town believed. Shelves lined with jars of salve, bundles of dried leaves, small charms tucked neatly into corners. But Nathaniel had watched her long enough to know this was only a mask. He searched until his hand brushed against a seam in the shelves, and with trembling force he pried open the hidden door. The chamber breathed cold air into his face, air that smelled of stone wax and something sour that clung to the skin. He lit a candle and stepped inside, his shadow stretching against the walls. The room was narrow, bare but for a heavy table and shelves that lined the back. And upon those shelves, lined in rows like relics in a church, rested 13 small jars, sealed with dark wax that had been pressed flat by a careful hand. Each jar bore a strip of parchment with letters inked in black, initials that Nathaniel recognized at once, the names of the mothers he had recorded in the parish ledger. His stomach turned as he lifted one. The wax cracked faintly, and through the glass he saw a bundle of cloth stiff with dried blood and milk. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. These were not simple remnants. These were offerings. Agnes had preserved them with care as though they were holy fragments of some sacred rite. One jar for each mother, each life stolen, each name left incomplete. Nathaniel placed the jar back among the others, his hands shaking, his breath ragged. He searched the chamber further, his candlelight trembling across the stone. He found markings carved faintly into the wall, the same strange symbols he had seen in her secret ledger. Circles broken by lines, crosses twisted upon themselves, signs that looked less like writing and more like wounds etched into the earth. They were arranged in careful rows as though the chamber itself had been turned into scripture. In front of the carvings, the jars sat like an altar, their contents waiting to be received by something that had no face, no name, no church, but this one room. Nathaniel realized then what Agnes believed. She thought she was preserving purity not in life but in death. She had stolen the essence of mothers at their moment of sacrifice, blood, milk, silence, and sealed it in glass as an offering to a god no one else prayed to. She had built her own religion from their suffering, her own order from their deaths. To her, these were not trophies of cruelty but holy vessels, proof that she had delivered not infants but purity itself. The weight of it pressed on Nathaniel until his knees weakened. He thought of the families who had wept, of Samuel Dorrance standing alone at his wife's grave, of the blank spaces in his book that now seemed louder than screams. This was the truth behind the calm face, behind the trusted hands, behind the silence that had been mistaken for mercy. Agnes had not been a servant of God, nor of healing, nor of the parish. She had been serving something only she could see, something that demanded silence where life was meant to cry. He stumbled back toward the door, clutching the ledger he had taken, knowing that what he carried was more than proof. It was a fracture in the world the town had built on trust. To speak of it would be to shatter their denial, to drag them into the same darkness that had trapped him. He feared what would happen when silence was finally broken, when the truth of the jars was laid bare before those who had called Agnes a savior. But he also knew it could not be hidden forever. The chamber would not stay secret, the names would not stay blank. Nathaniel blew out the candle as he stepped back into the cold night, the door of the chamber closing behind him with a sound that felt like the sealing of a coffin. The snow swallowed his tracks as quickly as he made them, but he knew there was no return now. He carried knowledge that could not be undone, a burden heavier than any ledger. The parish would soon have to face what lay behind Agnes's calm face, and when they did, they would find their trust had been placed not in a healer but in a keeper of silence who had built her faith upon the stillness of the dead. The trial of Agnes Whitford began on a morning colder than most, though the chill that filled the parish square came not from the air but from the weight of what had been uncovered. 13 jars had been carried out of her chamber, each sealed, each labeled, each carrying proof of what no one wanted to believe. They were placed on the long table of the court, their contents hidden but their meaning plain, and the sight of them alone was enough to divide the town. Some stood rigid, their faces pale, unable to reconcile the quiet midwife they had trusted with the horror now laid bare. Others shouted for justice, their grief erupting after years of silence. Yet even then, whispers wound their way through the crowd, voices that still insisted Agnes could not be guilty, that her calm hands had delivered mercy, not death. Agnes herself stood without chains, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her posture straight. She looked more like a woman attending Sunday service than one accused of ritual murder. When the charges were read, she did not flinch. When the jars were named as evidence, she did not tremble. She listened with her head bowed slightly as though in prayer, and when the time came to speak, her voice was steady, quiet, and terrifying in its simplicity. She told the court that she had given the mothers a gift, that she had spared them suffering, that she had led them to a silence deeper than pain. She spoke of the cries of infants as corruption, of childbirth as a burden too heavy for souls already bent by sin. She said she had not killed but delivered, carrying them past agony into peace, as though she alone had been chosen to guide them through that passage. Her words chilled the room because they were spoken without madness, without frenzy. They were delivered like scripture, rehearsed and calm, as if she believed every syllable. Husbands wept in fury, demanding that she be named a murderer, while others in the back of the hall lowered their eyes, unable to face the thought that the woman they had called healer had been a priestess of silence all along. The jury, 12 men chosen from the parish, shifted uneasily in their seats, caught between the evidence of the jars and the weight of their own trust in her. They struggled not only with what she had done, but with what it revealed about themselves. That they had allowed her into their homes, into their families, into their most vulnerable moments, To condemn her meant condemning their own blindness. The witnesses spoke one after another. Samuel Dorrance stood trembling, his grief sharpened into fury as he described how Agnes had barred him from the room where his wife and child had vanished into silence. Nathaniel Hale, pale and hollow-eyed, recounted the blank spaces in the parish ledger, the symbols in her secret book, the jars lined in her chamber like an altar. Their words painted a picture too terrible to ignore, yet still some clung to disbelief, muttering that childbirth was cruel, that death could come without reason, that perhaps Agnes had only preserved tokens out of misplaced devotion. Denial hung heavy in the air, a shield against the full truth. When the jury left to deliberate, the silence in the hall was unbearable. The townsfolk sat with their eyes fixed on the jars, as though they might burst open and spill out the cries that had been stolen. Hours passed, though they felt like days, until at last the jury returned. The foreman's face was drawn tight as he delivered the verdict. Guilty. The word echoed, sharp and hollow, yet it did not bring the relief the families had longed for. It felt too simple, too human a word for what Agnes had done. The sentence was read aloud, but the weight of it seemed to dissolve as soon as it was spoken. No punishment could match the scale of her crimes. No gallows or cell could measure the silence she had created. Some wept in relief, others in despair, and some left the hall with faces blank, unable to carry the truth back into their lives. Agnes herself only bowed her head, her expression serene, as if the verdict mattered little. To her, she had already succeeded. The jars had been filled, the ledger left blank, the silence preserved. Human law could not touch the faith she carried within, nor erase the devotion that had driven her. When she was led away, there was no struggle, no plea, no sign of regret. She walked with the same steady steps she had carried through the parish for years, as though she remained in control even in judgment. And in a way she did. The town had spoken, the jury had condemned Macabre, but the air in the hall was thick with the knowledge that justice had not truly been done. Agnes Whitford had built her faith on silence, and even in exposure that silence lingered. The verdict was swift, but it was unsatisfying, a hollow sound that could never equal the cries that had been denied. The court emptied, but the fracture remained. Neighbors no longer trusted each other as before. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Husbands watched the women who passed on the streets with suspicion, and the name of Agnes Whitford was whispered not as a curse, but as a wound. Evil had walked among them in plain sight, cloaked in innocence, and the law had tried to name it, to contain it. But the truth was heavier than any sentence. The truth was that silence had been allowed to grow in their midst, and no verdict could wash away the stain it left behind. Decades passed, and the parish tried to bury what had happened, but silence has a way of leaving stains that never fade. The homes where the mothers had once lived were taken up by new families. The streets repaired, the fields worked as if nothing had changed. Yet in the cemetery, 13 small stones stood apart, each nameless, each carved only with a date. They marked the mothers and the infants who never drew breath. Memorials not to lives lived, but to lives denied. People left flowers there in secret, as though afraid to be seen remembering too openly, as though the act of mourning itself might call the silence back. The records of Agnes Whitford's crimes were unsealed in time, though many wished they had remained locked away. The ledgers revealed not only the blank spaces where infant names should have been, but the coded notations Agnes had written in her own hand, the symbols no priest could fully explain. They became evidence not only of one woman's cruelty, but of the blindness of a town that had trusted her beyond question. New laws were written in the years that followed, rules meant to regulate midwifery, to ensure that no single woman could ever again hold such unchecked power in life and death. But laws do not erase memory. They only stand as reminders of what once slipped through the cracks. Whispers of the sect that had shaped Agnes in her youth faded into obscurity, their rituals scattered and denied, their names erased from history. Yet the essence of their teaching, that silence could purify, that the first breath of life was corruption, remained bound to her story. Even as the world moved forward, the idea lingered that such beliefs could hide anywhere, passed quietly from one generation to the next, waiting for another Agnes to give them shape. The parish told itself it was safe now, but beneath the surface the fear remained. Evil had not worn horns or shouted its presence. It had walked calmly among them, wrapped in shawls and prayers, feeding their trust while feeding the silence it worshipped. Visitors came to the cemetery in later years, drawn by the story whispered in neighboring towns. They stood before the 13 stones and asked the same questions that had haunted Samuel Dorrance and Nathaniel Hale in their time. How had no one seen? How had a community blinded itself so thoroughly to a pattern written plainly in its own records? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was Agnes truly alone? For if one parish could house such devotion to silence, what of the others? How many other towns had their own midwives, their own trusted hands, their own chambers hidden behind walls of herbs and prayers? The legacy of Agnes Whitford was not only the graves or the jars or the trial that had failed to satisfy. It was the reminder that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it wears the face of care, the voice of reason, the calm of service. Sometimes it hides behind innocence so complete that even grief itself bends to its will. The stones in the parish cemetery stood not only for 13 lives lost, but for the warning that trust, when left unquestioned, can be the most dangerous silence of all. And so the story lingers, heavy and unresolved, asking every generation the same question. How close can evil come before we see it for what it is? Could it happen again, in another place, under another name, hidden in plain sight? The answer is never certain, and that uncertainty is what gives the tale its weight. For the silence Agnes worshipped did not die with her. It waits always in the spaces where voices are not raised, in the blank lines of forgotten ledgers, in the quiet hands we never think to doubt.